Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Washington, Executive Director of the ESG Center here at the Conference Board. The ESG Center focuses on corporate governance, sustainability, and citizenship and philanthropy. Today, I'd like to welcome you to the latest edition of Governance Watch, our webcast series hosted in collaboration with the law firm Cle Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton. Today we're going to focus on the current outlook for the 2020 proxy season, and we've got a lot to cover today, so I'll skip right into introducing our panelists. I'm delighted to be joined by a number of terrific experts. We've got Sandra Flo, who's a partner at Cle Gottlieb, Mary Alcock, who's a counsel at Cle Gottlieb, and Bill Alton, who's Managing Director of Corporate Governance at Morrow Sodali. Before we get into substance, I've got a few housekeeping notes to cover. So please bear with me for a moment. First, we are offering CPE and New York State CLE credit for participating in today's live program. To get either credit, you need to stay online for the entire webcast. For those who want CPE credit, you need to enter your full name, email address, and specify CPE in the Request CPE Credit space at the bottom of your screen. Please note that 3 pop-up messages will occur during the program to confirm your participation. And please click OK each time you see one of those messages. For CLE credit, please download the CLE verification and CLE evaluation forms posted in the download section at the bottom of your screen. Complete them and email them to our friends at Cle Gottlieb at the email address provided on the forms. I'll provide a verification code later in this webcast, which you'll need to put on the verification form to earn CLE credit. I also want to underscore that we welcome audience participation today in the session. You can ask questions at any time by entering them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to work them into the conversation as we go ahead today, and any unanswered questions we'll answer via email after the webcast. Finally, a few other housekeeping notes. You can download a really excellent deck that Cle Gottlieb has put together of today's presentation. It's in the download section at the bottom of your screen. Also, please complete the evaluation form. Now that's separate from the CLE evaluation and verification form. It's an evaluation form about the webcast today at the end of today's session, and we can incorporate your feedback from that into future webcasts. You can also share this program with your colleagues. It'll be available on demand in about 48 hours. And if you want to see more of us, you can enlarge the video on your full screen by clicking on the 4 arrows in the upper right-hand corner of your screens. Okay, and now with that very difficult part of the program out of the way, let's talk about the outlook for the 2020 season. And before we get
done.
Oh, thank you, thanks. It's a struggle. Now before we get into specific topics, let's talk about the bigger picture. So, Bill, what have you learned from the off-season engagement that companies have had with shareholders in terms of, a little bit of the past about the company's reaction to the votes in the 2019 proxy season, and what you're picking up from the off-season engagement about what lies ahead in 2020?
Sure, Paul, and thanks for having me, and Sandra and Mary, great to be here with both of you. I would say the off-season engagement process has covered the typical range of ESG issues. Compensation is always a constant. I would say, particularly coming out of 2019, overboarding became a very noteworthy issue because of the adoption mid-season by Vanguard of an overboarding policy, pretty close to what BlackRock had already adopted. But I'd like to highlight on 2 high-level observations that we're seeing. First is what I would call engagement through a risk management lens. And by that I mean, I think there's an increasing awareness on the part of issuers that it's important to identify who they're engaging with, who they're speaking to, as opposed to just saying we're speaking with shareholders.
Right.
Well, not all shareholders are alike. And there are some, particularly the large index funds, the passive quantitative managers, that are interested in engagement not because they're making buy and sell decisions, but because they're really evaluating risk. And because of that, that leads to a different type of conversation. as opposed to when you're talking to an active money manager, also about ESG issues and maybe also about risk, but it does take on a different type of narrative. And so that awareness, I think, has been constructive and important. I would say it's created some frustrations maybe because sometimes an issuer wants to talk in more pragmatic terms around these risks, and some investors are thinking more, call it academically, about some of these issues. That is the one reason we're seeing independent directors participate more in these conversations and being either requested to, or that the companies are finding it necessary. Because when you're evaluating risk, right, you're not who are you really focused on? You're focused on the board. You want to understand how the board is assessing management's execution and the risks that come with that. So that's one high-level point. The other noteworthy development that we've seen, and this is certainly more incremental, is getting a little more precise, a little more granular on disclosure. And as opposed to in the last several years where, particularly on environmental and social issues, it was more, do you disclose or do you not disclose? And it was at a relatively simplistic level. Now it's, well, what are the issues that really are relevant to you, and what is different about your business versus, say, some of your peers, and how do you highlight those issues, and how do you identify those risks, and how do you execute your strategy? And again, also a very positive development. The frustration there, frankly, is just getting the shareholders to focus, to take the time to really evaluate companies in that manner. But I think the fact that we're seeing issuers making the effort, we're seeing their disclosures sort of feed into that, is a very positive development. So I'd say those are the two really big takeaways we've seen since the 2019 proxy season going into 2020.
Okay, interesting. So more tailored engagement in a way, and involvement of independent directors is something to look forward to or not look forward to, right?
Absolutely. That's right, depending.
And maybe I'll just note on that, and also thank you very much for having me here, and a delight to be speaking alongside both of you. Companies, I think, continue to wrestle with the question of having directors, though, doing that engagement directly. Who and whether, to offer it, whether to just kind of be ready to do it when an investor comes in and says, okay, this is really important to us, and how to prepare those directors.
Yes.
No surprise to anybody, right? But not everybody sitting on the board has necessarily got the same facility in talking to investors, in that kind of a setting. And so, an investor will sometimes ask for somebody, and the company will kind of, we'd actually like to offer up this person instead. So there's an ongoing dialogue, I think, there.
It's a great point, and I would say it's when directors are considering the individuals who hold leadership positions on the board, not just independent chair or independent lead director, but the chairs of key committees. To me, it should be part of the job description that, if needed, this is someone
they could do that.
That can do that.
And just one note on this, actually, we're coming out with a report from the conference board soon on board and shareholder engagement. One thing companies are doing that is a way of addressing this issue is some companies are sort of proactively saying, okay, we're going to have these few directors reach out to all of our shareholders or all of our major shareholders. So it's not as reactive, it's really proactive. That allows the company to choose the director or two who will be doing this. It also means that when the directors are engaging, they are meeting with a whole bunch of different shareholders. So they're getting a broad exposure to different views of shareholders, and not just maybe responding to, okay, this particular squeaky wheel has this view, this one has this view. This way the directors are bringing back into the boardroom a broader perspective of shareholder engagement.
Yeah, and there is something about that firsthand experience that even if the content is the same as what management would share, the fact that the director had that direct
and that's
experience.
why it's useful sometimes for them to meet with more than just one, because otherwise they can come back with a sort of distorted view of what the shareholder base may.
The only danger with that is that there are, as you were saying, and you'll know this better than I do, but there are certain investors that really care who they talk to,
Yeah.
right? And so if you've got your kind of your own
Yeah.
way of presenting it and it doesn't kind of line up with the investor, you might not give them what they're looking for.
Right.
So,
Well, one hopes that the lead
Things to be
independent
balanced.
director, exactly.
Things to be
So,
That's right.
perhaps a topic for an entirely separate webcast. But Sandra, why
All
don't
of
you
these topics.
exactly
That's right.
exactly. Sandra, why don't you talk a little bit what you're seeing in terms of early indicators for big topics in the 2020 proxy season?
Sure. Well, so in terms of what we have been seeing come in, and Mary, feel free to chime in, but governance for sure. John Chevedden continues to be very active with a lot of proposals. Obviously, others as well, but we've seen quite a few from him so far. There's been a real focus on some of the big topics from last year of special meeting and written consent and that kind of thing. Expecting ESG, and we'll talk more about that later, but ESG will continue to be, including the E and the S part,
Right.
continue to be really pretty prominent. And then the other thing I would just sort of say, and again, we'll talk about this more later, but dominating the preparation for this year's season has been conversation around process, around some of the changes at the SEC, how everybody's going to react to that. And some of it's pretty uncertain, and so there's a lot of kind of second guessing going on, and trying to figure out how to get your best outcome. So we'll talk about that more later.
Right. In fact, pretty soon, because
Yeah,
yes, it's
momentarily.
all of it momentarily. Because
Right.
if you for the holiday season, we bring you some anxiety from the
Right,
SEC,
exactly.
right? How to
Little
deal
gift
with a little gifts.
wrapped with a bow.
Exactly. So let's talk about the new staff legal bulletin 14K that came out as a follow-up to 14J and 14I over the last couple of years. So, Sandra, how do you think? Do you want to talk a little bit about the substance of it and how you think that this latest staff legal bulletin is going to affect no action letters for the 2020 season? And do you see companies changing their internal processes to deal with this new legal bulletin?
Sure. Well, as you said, it comes on top of two prior staff legal bulletins that really talk about the same topics. They lay out how a company should be thinking about presenting their arguments when they're trying to exclude on the basis of an ordinary business argument and on the basis of the economic relevance argument. It doesn't, in real substance, change a whole lot. It's for the most part commentary about kind of how best to make your arguments, and others may differ, but to be honest, I didn't find it particularly earth-shattering. I think some of what they highlight, I think you could have gotten from a read of the no action letters last year, and in particular the ones that were successful, right? But they emphasize, and helpful, I guess, to have the SEC kind of laying out what they found most important. But emphasizing, so those earlier slabs emphasize the need for the board to be part of the decision, and to be really thoughtful, and to have that analysis be laid out in the no action letter.
Right.
And while it's certainly true that they granted no action relief, even if that wasn't the case, right? There were certain compelling cases where they didn't need that board analysis. For the most part, the ones that were successful had that, but there were many who had a board analysis that also were not successful, right? And I think this is an attempt on the part of the SEC to sort of say, here's what we found persuasive about this. Here's what some people were missing, right? And I guess what I would highlight among that is being more specific. They don't say this quite directly, but we've been seeing the benefit of a data-driven analysis in that, right? The more concrete you can be with some data points, the better. To really focus in on the differences between what you've got and what's being proposed.
Right, what
and
the
why,
SEC calls the delta, right?
Right, the delta, exactly. To talk about past votes, particularly if they were high, right? And how to be able to either distinguish that or say, okay, we've now improved after that, or here's what we've got that's different from that. And then the other thing that I thought was very interesting that they really emphasized was talking about your shareholder engagement, which I think is a trend.
Is definitely their message this proxy.
Yeah, right. It's a trend in no action letters. It's also a trend in disclosure for companies in their opposition statements, for example, to be talking about the engagement they're doing and why they're fairly confident that what they're doing is a good thing from the perspective of a number of their shareholders. That's emphasized in the new slab as well.
Yeah, which is interesting because shareholder engagement doesn't necessarily go directly to whether something is a significant policy issue, whether it right. But it's interesting. It's sort of like the SEC is saying it's not enough to tell us that your board has touched this issue and considered it not to be significant to your company. You really have to provide us with the substantive reasons why it's not. And part of that may also be a little of the process reasons, like you've talked to your shareholders, and this is all led into the board's thinking that the change between what the company is doing and what's proposed is not significant to the company, right? Yeah.
Right. And in terms of how practice is going to change, I actually don't think that there's all that much of any of that that's really different, right? Yeah. So I think it just gives maybe a little bit of a better read into the SEC's mind, right?
Yeah. It would strike me there's also a timing issue too, because most companies have already completed their shareholder engagement before they get shareholder proposals.
Correct.
And you can maybe anticipate what you may get, but not always. So sometimes
unless you've already done it, there's not much time when you get the proposal in to sort of then quickly engage and in time for getting the no action letter back. Yeah.
And you have to be careful about engaging with shareholder outreach once you get a proposal in.
Yeah.
Because then you start getting tangled up in the proxy solicitation rules.
Exactly right.
I do think that though that most of the situation in which it's going to be most relevant really is when you've had a prior proposals, when you're adopting something maybe that's not quite what passed or what almost passed, right? And then you get a new proposal in. And so I do think in that context, companies are typically doing some outreach about those things, right? And that's I think where this may come into play the most.
Right.
But fair point.
If I could ask,
sure.
Well, I'll give you a thesis I have on this. So and you can shoot it down. But it strikes me that there are very few sort of black and white shareholder proposals anymore. Most of the bylaw charter, as you were saying, Sandra, we have written consent, special meeting, but there are very few of these left, at least among the large cap issuers that tend to get these. So it strikes me that most shareholder proposals going forward are going to be more disclosure-based initiatives. Provide more explanation on this, or explain how you are achieving certain goals. And I just wonder, because if that's the nature of most of these proposals, it's going to make this even tougher to get no action relief, because I think the general mindset is, sure, if shareholders want more disclosure, they should have the ability to request that.
I guess it depends, right? It depends on the nature of the disclosure and whether it gets into micromanagement or not, right?
I agree with that. I also think I take your point as to where things are going. I think we're a couple years out still, right? Yeah. I think there are still a lot of proposals out there that are really substantive, like change your bylaws to do this or change, right? Like so. I think a fair point and something to continue to think about, but it's a little bit in advance, I think, of this upcoming season.
So my thesis isn't totally off.
No,
you may just be ahead of the curve, Phil.
Exactly.
I try my best.
So Sandra, quickly, do you think that the latest staff legal bulletin is going to improve companies' chances of getting no action relief, or does it not really move the needle there?
To the extent that it helps people be a little bit more focused in how to write the best argument, maybe.
Okay, got it. I think it may not be changing the theory much, but it does provide a bit of a roadmap, I think, for companies. And sometimes it helps to have the SEC say things 2 or 3 times, so it actually sinks in. So Mary,
doesn't really matter what you write.
Exactly, because you might So let's talk about that.
Absolutely.
That's tricky, right? Because you may get no answer, or you may get an oral answer. So how should companies prepare for this? This is particularly the anxiety-producing.
Actually, the first thing I was going to say, and I was going to look right into the camera for the audience. Don't panic.
Okay.
Stay calm. So the SEC did throw a huge wrench in the works. They were not maybe well-oiled works, but they were understood. Everybody knew how to play the game. It was all laid out. The SEC clearly wants out of the no action letter business, but I think sprung this late in the game, and also did not give enough details to, at least reassure how in the short run this is going to work. Obviously, it's going to have impact, very much out into the future. The fact that you just might not get a response. So just to quickly recap, what the SEC has said that it will start with this proxy season is that certain no action letters, they will in fact write out a no action, agree or deny letter, laying out their reasons. Others they're going to give an oral answer to, but not actually write a letter. And then also, and I think this is clearly the most problematic, they also have said that they just may not respond. Neither agree or deny at all.
So let me ask you about that last category and why that even exists, because it seems like the amount of thought that goes into deciding not to give a response is about the same amount of thought that you would need to go into saying yes or no. I'm orally, right? So I'm just wondering what shareholder proposals do you think the SEC is just going to remain mum on?
I think it's going to be the ones that are fairly well settled.
Okay.
Where there's a clear history of them saying either yes or no. That before people might have still written in trying to distinguish themselves.
Yeah.
The greater, I think, thought process behind it, and this is just my guess, is what I started with. I think they just don't want to be the arbiter. And I think they see this as one way, and is not a foolish thought of theirs, that people who might have been putting letters in simply won't, because they might not get an answer. And that, frankly, is the trickiest for an issuer, because if you get a letter, then fine, the process goes as it always went. A verbal response, I know people are very nervous about that, but actually the SEC has clarified that somewhat. They have made clear that they will call not just the issuer, but also the proponent. And also, and this just went up very recently, they now have a little chart on their website that says, the name of the issuer, the name of the, the topic of the proposal, whether it was agreed or denied by the SEC, and whether it was oral or a letter. So at least to the extent that people were wondering how is how do you get the oral, the fact that you got an oral response out to the proponent or to to others, now you can track it. What we don't know is whether that chart will also say issuer, proposal, proponent, no answer. Or whether they just simply will not answer and not, record it on the chart. And I think this is this SEC approach is a real game changer for issuers. I think it changes completely the thought process that went into, do we do a letter, do we not do a letter, how much effort do we do to keep a letter out, a proposal out by reaching out to the proponent, and I think a lot of us were thinking, well, one thing the SEC might be doing is trying to bring the 14A8 process, no action letter process, more in line with, frankly, the no action letter process on virtually everything else under the securities laws, which is, if you're an issuer and you have an issue arise, then you look at the other no action letters that have been issued. Obviously, they apply only to the person who wrote in and asked for the advice. But if you had a series and a history of no action letters on your facts, you would say, you know what, or at least your outside securities lawyers would say, you know what, you have a pretty good case for going forward and not expecting to draw the ire of the SEC. And so I think a lot of us were thinking, oh, okay, so they're trying to, sort of pull back from, pull this kind of shareholder proposal into, that greater approach, which is not crazy. but it's a huge shock to the system.
Right.
And it was certainly not helped by another sort of wrench in the works that came from Glass Lewis.
Right, yeah.
And I know we're going to talk a lot more about Glass Lewis's proposed changes or actual changes to their voting policies, but one that was very surprising, at least to me, was that they, at least at the moment, we'll see what happens and whether they'll revise it, they have said that if if an issuer does not state in their proxy statement that they got a shareholder proposal and either it got no answer or it got an oral answer and explain, sort of the process, they will withhold a vote from the nomination committee.
Right.
Nominating governance committee. And I think this was definitely something that threw a lot of people because, again, it sort of tweaked how you start thinking about, do I do a letter? Do I not do a letter? And now, you might have rationally said, I just don't do a letter. I just keep it out.
Yeah.
But now you have Glass Lewis to contend with.
Right.
If you just keep it out with no, sort of blessing from the SEC, you're going to have no votes on your nomination and governance, and nobody likes telling the directors that they've been recommended against.
So what should companies be doing in light of this? I mean, because they're facing greater uncertainty because you don't have the traditional no action process with the SEC. You also have Glass Lewis putting its thumb on the scales of actually putting the proposal in your proxy statement, basically, if it's a situation where the SEC has been silent or just gave an oral answer. So what should a company do practically in assessing this, since it does change the calculus?
No, absolutely. One thing I would recommend highly is just keep watching the space, because I would not be at all surprised if, Glass Lewis's action, maybe tweaked how the SEC was going to handle it, or the response to Glass Lewis's approach, either could be embraced by ISS, who I think was caught surprised, or frankly, Glass Lewis could end up, pulling it back, just given the sort of, outcry from the issuer community. I think the process this year is, as I said, I wouldn't panic because I think it's going to be a little bit of a free-for-all this year. I also, frankly, I think all of the sort of typical shareholder proponents were also caught surprised by this. So in my mind, I think all of this added up together to me, and feel free and jump in and pounce on me, because this is just my crazy idea.
Throw it up.
I am inclined to not submit letters. I have always advised my clients to, heavily consider whether you go about submitting a letter, cost, and then, sort of the SEC, backing that it's a valid proposal.
Right, yeah.
As opposed to you're trying to decide whether it really is something that should be put up to vote by your shareholders. On Glass Lewis sort of weighing in on that, I think, and the issuers always have to do this, but I think you have to go through your shareholder list and figure out, is Glass Lewis followed by many, of your shareholders? Keep an eye, or talk to your other shareholders, maybe not about a proposal per se, but what they think about, Glass Lewis's statement. I could see talking to, Vanguard or BlackRock about that. I wouldn't get too panicked about leaving something out, because I think the odds of some of the very voluminous proponents taking you to court, which really would be the only other
recourse,
venue, is pretty small.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And I suppose another thing you could do if you're in-house counsel is make sure your board understands the changing dynamics here.
Absolutely.
Because boards can become really accustomed to, okay, if the company says we're going to seek no action relief, they're likely going to succeed, right? And then we're left with these proposals where they will engage, and this is our sort of track record on that. That kind of pattern, that kind of certainty that companies have experienced in the past, or predictability, if not certainty, is now no longer there. So making sure your board knows that, thereby reducing your own stress level, right?
No, it's an excellent point.
Probably
Yeah, I
important.
agree. That's really important. We've got a number of clients that are, I think a number of people, it depends on the issue, right? A number of people are still putting in the no action letters, and I think that makes sense to me, because while we do have a little bit of a sense that maybe what the SEC is trying to do is go with an oral answer on things that are easy,
Yeah.
right? Where they can kind of look at it fairly quickly, give a pretty easy answer, and then call up people, and maybe, and hopefully they use the chart, which then gets the disclosure out there and helps things. But and then we understand the idea is to have them be able to spend their time then on the more complicated issues. And so Mary's watched this space, I think, is also really how the SEC is handling it, right? But so, a number of clients putting in their letters, let's see what happens, right? And maybe we'll get an answer, and maybe that we can work with that, and that'll be great, right? But I agree, there's been a real emphasis on making sure the board understands, because it could be a real shock to folks who are not sufficiently prepared to be in this space of, oh my God, the SEC is just not going to say, and so now what do we do?
Right,
So,
and be right.
Well, I was just going to add, we all, I'm sure, work with companies have very distinct cultures that on an issue like this, some will go to great lengths to try to keep a proposal out of the proxy, and will look for brilliant lawyering to find the angle or the opportunity to get exclusion. And then there are other companies that are just sort of roll with it, and so what, no big deal to get in the proxy. And as someone who tries to have common sense prevail as much as possible, I just think these are very case-specific assessments. And I think the guidance to companies has to be, you have to weigh perhaps some of the risks and challenges of pursuing this versus, okay, if this is in the proxy, what does it mean?
Yes.
Is it a reputational risk, or is it going to fly below the radar and get 2%? What is it going to get material? I think it's...
So it becomes much less of just, here's this, not to denigrate, but this legal game with the SEC, right?
Exactly.
And much more a question of business judgment, where shareholder engagement is probably going to play a larger role. And it's often going to be it should be the board's judgment on this, right? Management will advise with the assistance of outside advisors, but this is really a business call, basically, that the board is likely going to need to make.
That's right.
Not that they don't already have enough on their plates, but this is something else.
Now, I will say that there are a number of proposals that over the last year or two used to be things that you could have put in a no action letter, and the SEC is sort of evolving positions on that to make it less likely that you would get relief, right? Has resulted, I think, in a number of areas where proposal comes in and in-house and external counsel both agree, you know what, we're not even going to bother making these arguments. It's not worth it. We're just going to put it in, and we'll do that assessment that you were talking about, right? So I actually do think that people have had a little more practice in making those judgment calls than maybe a couple of years ago.
When under the prior administration, when no action relief was suspended in a few areas, then companies
we had to think about that.
Had to do that. So we've had a little bit of a trial run.
Yeah.
Okay, so now going from don't panic, but the overall view, right? Let's turn to some specific areas, including board diversity. So it's interesting. This is an area where the shareholder proposals that were submitted last year didn't fare all that well, on average about 18%. But we did see a notable increase in votes against board members, which may be related to diversity. So in 2020, ISS has said that it's generally going to recommend against the chair of a nominating governance committee and other directors responsible for the nomination process when the company's putting forth an all-male board slate in the Russell 3000 and S&P 1500. Glass Lewis adopted a similar policy in 2019. This goes alongside BlackRock's policy that it expects boards to have at least 2 female directors. So, Bill, what do you think What has been the impact of these policies on shareholder voting last year, and what do you see coming down the pike?
So this specific policy is clearly going to impact smaller companies than larger ones. The vast majority of large cap companies, if not all of them at this point, have at least one, and in most cases more than one, female director. I think the challenge for large caps will be, as the conversation evolves beyond gender to race and ethnicity, which is a far more complicated conversation and complicated disclosure. So for small cap companies, for IPO companies, I think there is a greater scrutiny of their boards and practices, and I think they have to be cognizant of that. These are companies that have flown below the radar for many years. They don't typically get the shareholder proposals that we've been discussing. But ISS and Glass Lewis are certainly going to do evaluations of them. And now we know the big index funds, who probably own stakes, if not large stakes, in these smaller companies, are going to look at these. So it's important. And even for these companies with limited resources, it's really important that the boards be on top of these issues. This is a perfect example of where you want to mitigate the risk, right? You don't want to wait till the bomb has exploded on you and you have to respond. But I want to go a little further, though, on this topic, because I think it's important that this not be a superficial exercise. And I fear, in fact, I've witnessed with some companies where, and by the way, as someone who has seen the benefits of diversity, so I very strongly support it, but it has to be done the proper way. And I fear that some companies, they have to respond to this policy. We have to find a woman to be on our board, or we have to find a minority to be on our board. But it has to be the right person. It has to be someone of content and someone who's going to fill a gap, perhaps through a board evaluation process of a talent, a skill, and experience that they need. And I fear through the pushing of these policies that some of these smaller companies are just going to try to appease rather than try to get the right person. So I would also, to your same comment, Mary, about not panicking, I think it's important not to panic, to embrace this, to pursue it, but to really find someone who's going to add value, and through diversity, but someone who's not just going to check a diversity box, and not really move the board forward.
And the same is true for when boards are pressured to have someone with particular expertise. So, for example, a cybersecurity expert or human capital management expert, you want these people to be utility infielders so that they can do whatever a director needs to do, because you never know what's going to come over the transom.
Absolutely. And if there's a perception that someone is being, put on the board, that's going to affect board dynamics in a really negative way.
Right. Inside the boardroom and in your relationship with shareholders, to the extent that they're aware of that. Yes.
The other thing I wanted to mention, though, is that there's an interplay between another focus area for shareholders and others that in some ways actually helps, I think, a little bit. The focus on overboarding, right? Where there's an increasing amount of pressure on companies to not have a board that has been there for a long time, particularly on average, but also some focus on the director or two who may have been there for a long time. And I think companies are still able to make an argument about that and the benefits of some experience and an overall refreshment approach and a range of tenures among the board. But it does, that conversation does allow a company to quite thoughtfully think about who they're putting on, who should come off, and I think it's really important for companies when they're doing that process to be thinking about diversity as one of the aspects. Right?
It's a great point, and I think a lot, again, focusing on the small caps, there's so many of them that don't even do formal evaluations of the board. And Sandra, to your point, I think that these are things that should be part of a board evaluation in a structured way, so that it really stimulates a conversation and it helps the board identify the types of candidates that they want to pursue, and keeping in mind these overboarding issues, because we know that, historically a lot of minority and female board members tend to be the ones who have been overboarded because they've been in
such demand.
Right. Exactly. Yes. So it's all, so for the small caps that this issue is largely focused on, they need to embrace it, they need to apply the resources, but do it in a thoughtful and constructive way.
And even for large caps, thinking about director succession planning in the same way you do CEO succession planning, right? And you're right, the tenure overboarding, that will create more opportunities. Yep. So it's really, the time is really right for thoughtful director succession planning.
Yeah. Another point or two that I just wanted to make on that topic. So first of all, I would say there are a lot of really qualified women out there, right?
Yes.
So
that's exactly.
Just want to put that out there.
This is not a question of supply by any means, right?
That's why they don't need to just go with the overboard.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Exactly. One can really carefully think about skill set, because there are a lot of really skilled and qualified people out there. And I shouldn't make that just about women. That's generally. Yeah. The second thing, though, I just want to mention is that right now the focus is on having at least one. Right. Mm-hmm. There's a fair amount of research out there, and I've spoken to a number of female board members. No, it's not two, actually. Great. Yeah. So female board members will say that when you are the first on the board, that's obviously important for the board, but there's it doesn't necessarily make the change in a board dynamic. Mm-hmm. Even two does not. Yeah. So it really is three, whether it's racial diversity or gender, right? That number of three is actually pretty important. Yeah. And I can see the trends towards, we've already seen, as you mentioned, right, institutional investors starting to look not just at one, but at two. Yeah. And I think that'll increase to three, right? And there will also be a focus on majority at some point. Yeah. It will move in the direction of reflecting the population, right? So I think it's also important for people to keep that in mind. I think that's more at the moment of a large cap problem, as you're identifying. I think I agree with you. The small caps are going to be focused more on just getting their one, especially in certain industries that are very male dominated, right? But I do think companies should be thoughtful, not just in who they select, but also in their strategy over time, because I think there will be more to come on this. Yes. At the management level too, quite honestly, because that's the other.
Yeah, so that's. I was going to ask that as another question. So right, there's been a fair amount of focus on. Yeah, no, this is great. And let's broaden the question of diversity beyond gender. So, what do you see on the horizon in terms of investors or others pushing for greater diversity, not just with the board, but with management? And how are you advising your clients on this subject?
Take go ahead.
Well, I'll just so this would come under sort of a human capital management issue, and it actually is a natural extension of what we've just been talking about. So when you talk about diversity of the board or diversity of senior management, right? Initially, the conversation was very simplistic. Just what are the numbers, right? Well, you're either diverse or you're not diverse, but there wasn't really any context of how do you get there, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I think the conversation will be evolving to now where when women and minority employees early in their careers, how are you encouraging them to pursue career paths that over time will make them qualified to serve in senior management, to serve on boards. And so it's now becoming a human capital management question around how are companies, through their workforce diversity efforts, really encouraging those individuals to move in those directions.
I could not agree more. I could not agree more. And I think it explains what someone the other day was saying. I don't understand why people are so focused on this, EEOC data or, women and minorities by job category and et cetera, et cetera. And it perfectly makes sense because, a lot of people say they have workplace diversity, programs and pushes but if you take a look and if you have the data and you see that okay, maybe the workforce is, just to focus on women for a second, 50-50. But if you break it down by tier of,
Right.
sort of job, suddenly, at the upper tiers, it is not 50-50.
Right, and that's sort of what's
Right.
been masked a little bit heretofore, right? Focus on
Exactly.
board diversity. It's easy from the photographs and the proxy statement. You
Yeah.
can figure that out. And then often there's overall workforce diversity, but it's really, okay, let's look at it in the
it's-
upper echelons
Well,
of the company.
and success,
Yeah.
success planning
Right.
All the way
going
down.
all the way down.
And pay equity.
Right.
And pay equity.
So let's, before we turn to some other topics, one last question on diversity. Do you see any changes coming down the pike this year, Sandra, when it comes to shareholder proposals on diversity? Do you think we're going to see different types of proposals this year?
I think we'll continue to see what we have seen.
Mhm.
Certainly, we're seeing, some initiatives. The New York City Controller's Boardroom Accountability Project, now in its 3.0 version,
right.
is one to be mentioned. Although I haven't heard that they're particularly focusing in this season on proposals as such. But they're certainly pushing for the Rooney Rule and focusing
Right.
on diversity, and it's not just gender; it's racial
Yeah.
as well. So certainly focus by a number of different constituents. Whether that plays out in the proposals, I mean, there have been a number historically of pay equity, of gender. I expect those to continue.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we'll see a huge shift. Is my
Right.
Yeah.
current-
But a lot
my
of the
current
action
thinking.
is going to be happening in the engagement process.
I think that's
then.
right.
Yeah, which is frankly where it often has more impact, right?
Yes.
Yeah. In fact, sometimes these proposals can backfire because it doesn't get a very high vote, right?
Right.
So turning from, diversity is part of ESG, but let's turn to E&S topics. So in 2019, environmental and social topics represented a majority of shareholder proposals, with the most popular ones being political spending, the environment, human capital, including diversity, and supply chain issues. Sandra, looking at 2020, do you see those remaining? This is like a countdown, like the top 4 in 2019 were, the top 4 in 2020 will be. What do you think will be the biggest issues in the E&S space in 2020?
Well, I think so. I think it's going to be the same sort of constellation, maybe a little movement around the edges, but political spending in an election year, I mean, there's almost certainly going to be a fair amount of focus there, right? I can't imagine that coming down, right? That's going to continue to be a focus. And with all of the dialogue kind of more broadly on climate change, the environment, of course, is going to be right up there, right? So those two, I think, will be right at the top. I can't imagine them being lower. We've already talked about human capital, and that's a particular focus as well. So I think all of that pretty much is the emphasis.
Well, more of same, but also picking up on your point, way back. I think
I can't remember.
If there is any change, I think it's going to be around the edges of being more focused and more detailed. Don't just give us the pay data, give us the breakdown this way and that way and the other.
Yeah.
But category-wise, I completely agree with Sandra.
Although, if you get too detailed, then you do run into the micromanagement question, which could allow the company to exclude the proposal,
that is true,
right?
Although now with the SEC not necessarily
weighing in, right?
We'll
so
see.
interesting.
It's an interesting dynamic.
An interesting related development too, and we'll see how it now all plays out. But tell me if you both have seen this as well. I've seen it, I would say, a greater amount of negotiation between issuers and proponents. Again, particularly around these disclosure-based issues. Because I think the proponents are realizing that there's only so much you can accomplish through 1488, right? And these are proponents, for the most part, on these E&S issues. These are believers, right? We know there are proponents that have ulterior motives, but these are proponents who believe in their cause and are pursuing their cause. But I think they've recognized that 1488 only gets you so far, is somewhat adversarial in nature, and that constructive dialogue and negotiation can be beneficial too. And I wonder if all of that, how that overlays everything.
I agree with that entirely. I think
I agree entirely, but and totally cut you off.
That's okay. That's okay. You may be about to say.
You agree so much, you're going to say something else.
No, I'm sorry. My
No.
quick point, it probably is your point because we talk about these issues a lot, is that the one thing that 14A8 does is it gets teensy tiny shareholders on the engagement map.
Right.
Sorry.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
Well, so what I was going to say though is that there are notable exceptions of people who will not engage.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right.
One in particular.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I completely agree that there is really an increased level of engagement that's been ramping up, I think, the last, I'd say, maybe 2 years.
Yeah.
And I think that'll continue. And I think it's also a way to manage the uncertainty of this process, right? Because you've got who knows what's going to happen with the SEC and how all that's going to play out. And so you're better off engaging and seeing if you can kind of deal with it,
Right.
come to an agreement, have the proposal get withdrawn, and then you don't have to worry about what the
Right,
SEC is going to
right.
do.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And to those proponents who are willing to, the old mindset used to be, well, I have to submit the shareholder proposal to get the company's attention. Otherwise, they're not going to talk to me. And
That's changed.
That is totally changed. And so I would ask to the proponents, I would say, reach out to the issue. Don't make it adversarial right from the
It's a
outset.
gamble for both sides now
Absolutely.
with the no action, with the shareholder proposal approach. And the topics we're talking about may lend themselves much better to engagement than even to trying to codify. You may get more detail through engagement than you would through a shareholder
Yeah,
proposal.
I completely agree.
So let's turn to, sorry.
No, I was just going to add that to Bill's point about disclosure, though, I think that's often one of the big outcomes from the engagement process. I think that's also, as you were saying earlier, one of the big outcomes of the pre-season engagement, right? And if you're a company that doesn't get a lot of shareholder proposals, for example, I think that's somewhere that you can be focusing on, because I think investors are, whether they're giving you those proposals or not, they care about how you're communicating with them and where your emphasis is. And so trying to think about some of those same hot topic areas that other companies are seeing through the proposals
Right.
is I think something that companies that even don't necessarily get a lot of proposals can.
But put it
can
on
deal
your
with.
agenda as a company to
Exactly.
talk to your shareholders about, even if you don't
Exactly.
have a proposal. If
Where-
you're seeing
what do
it
you
out
care
there
about
and obviously looking at the shareholders' policies on this. So let's turn to compensation.
Absolutely.
Okay, so sort of a lightning round set of questions on
absolutely.
compensation. So CEO pay ratio, anything in year 3?
In year 3, I think it's going to be much like year 2.
Okay.
Boring. Sorry,
is-
not to say.
Frankly, pretty boring.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot of talk back when this first came out that institutional shareholders would really start paying attention when they saw it had a 3-year track record. I haven't seen any evidence of that, and I don't think it's really going to push the needle at all.
Okay. And even with the emphasis on the BRT statement and inclusive capitalism and all that, purpose of a corporation, do you think the CEO pay ratio may become a hook for that, for those discussions, or maybe not?
I can certainly see them trying, but I think it's a poor hook.
Got it. Okay,
So
cool.
I wouldn't bother.
All right. Okay. So now let's talk about say on pay, because we saw last year a notable decline in the support for company say on pay proposals. There were a lot more proposals that failed to get at least 80% support. So what contributed to that in the last year, and what should companies be doing about it looking ahead for 2020?
I think one thing, I think it's very much industry driven, partially. So think about your industry and think about it from that perspective. But as for why, I think it's the institutional investors doing more of their own legwork and not following ISS. I was reading an article that said that ISS, and I might not get the numbers totally right, so don't quote me, but said to vote no on say on pay of 13.5% of the Russell 3000, and I think it was CalSTRS. It was like 49%.
Yeah.
So I think there are obviously CalSTRS has always been a big player,
Right.
but that's what all I can put it down to, because frankly, otherwise, I don't really see, there's not been a radical shift. People, I think, and I'd be interested in your views, I think that people are paying more attention to the compensation, they're doing, disclosure, they're starting to think about, what people want, different ways to, different measures to use. We're trying to work in sustainability into measures. So I don't think it's a change in compensation practices that have led to this. I just think it's frankly more people focusing on it.
And maybe the downturn in the market at the end of last
That
year.
never helps.
Right. That could have contributed to it.
Yeah.
And I've also heard that there's a bit of fatigue among investors about the quantum of compensation, frankly. That I don't know, Bill, if you've heard anything else.
No,
or what you're telling your clients to prepare for in terms of engaging on SAMP this year.
So SAMP is a really interesting issue, whatever you think about it. From a voting standpoint, because it's obviously very complicated, but it's also used as a voting issue for maybe things that aren't core to the compensation program. So if you're displeased with a company's performance, if you're displeased with a certain business decision on the part of the company, there are various reasons for triggers to opposition. And it's interesting, even that you're saying, Paul, how there were a lot more below 80%, but on a relative basis, let's keep it in
most
perspective.
are like 95.
Right.
Most are still doing very well. But having said that, I think there are a couple of interesting things to be aware of. Number one is, and we continue to see this happen, that when a company has gotten 95% each year, every year, there's maybe a complacency that can set in, and an assumption that, we have no problems, our shareholders support this. That you cannot make that assumption. If anything, you have to assume that your key investors didn't really look very closely at your CD. And that's just the reality of it, because they cannot look at whatever it is, 3,000, 5,000 CDNAs in a 3-month period. So which ones are they going to take a closer look at?
So you may always be vulnerable.
So so that's why the off-season engagement, as we've been discussing, is so crucial. That's when you can go back to those key investors. Okay, I know I got 95% on my say and pay, but what do you think of our disclosure? What do you think of our pay program? And there oftentimes will be things that will come out of that, because what we see very consistently is when say and pay, unlike shareholder proposals, will go from 95 to 55 in 1 year, right? Where shareholder proposals often are very more gradual incremental, right? And when it goes from 95 to 55, and you have investors who voted against that were in favor, and you talk to them, and they're like, we didn't change anything about our program. Why are you voting against this year? Oh, well, I didn't really take that close a look in the past. I don't really like this. I don't really like that. And suddenly things come out. Well, don't wait for that.
Right.
And so that's why those conversations are so critical. We do see companies, particularly with turnover of executives. Sometimes there are pay packages on the way out or the way in that can be of issue. Again, magnitude of pay related things or lack of performance based. But in general, most companies have pretty reasonable structures to their pay. Right? There's some certain industries like the financial services always get beaten up for the discretionary nature of some of their decisions. But in general, I think companies have reasonable pay structures, but they just have to be vigilant on these particulars and really stay connected to their investors.
Got it. So let me pause for a second here. CLE Code Announcement. For those who are interested in obtaining CLE credit, the verification code, which you'll need to include in the verification form, is 11963. Okay. Any advice for folks on hedging disclosure this year?
Most companies, most companies have hedging policies. I would be stunned that there are companies who don't, or if they don't, aren't quickly putting one in. I think most companies' policies cover everybody. That's the one thing to double check. You do have to say not just officers, directors, but all employees. But I think this is going to be not at all a big deal. Read what you've been putting in every year anyway. Make sure it matches your policy, and if your policy is a little bit limp, strengthen it, because it's, not, you're not going to have a wave of your employees saying, my God, now I can't do my forward purchase contracts. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Okay, great.
Slow hanging fruit.
So before we wrap up, the SEC's proposed rules, right? on shareholder proposals.
2 seconds.
And exactly. And proxy advisors, what's going to happen?
Well, I think it's not a this year item, first of all.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
So another reason not to panic.
That's right. Theme for the
Theme,
whole
very-
for the
There's a lot of
whole
game
session.
left to play.
Yeah.
So not this year, but looking ahead.
Not this year. Looking ahead, it'll be interesting to see how the 14A8 proposals play out, because I think there is the potential to see something of that. At the same time, there's a fair amount in there that may not be quite as practical. Some of the pieces about engagement, where mandating it, it's kind of hard to see how those pieces would work. So we'll see on that. On proxy advisory.
It's I think again, it's not going to be a this year. I think that what's been proposed is not really going to be too change the landscape too much. Aside from, frankly, being able to embed your response, to ISS or Glass Lewis's proposal in their advice. That if that stays in, I think that's going to be very interesting. The thing I'm sort of amused by, or looking forward to seeing how it plays out, is ISS's argument that it should be treated differently. It's an investment advisor, registered and everything, and it should be treated as such, thereby sort of throwing Glass Lewis right under the bus. And so, very interesting how that's going to play out, but it is definitely a down the road.
Yeah, that lawsuit will be key.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, Paul, on the shareholder proposals, I would just throw out that if issuers are expecting the higher thresholds to lead to fewer proposals, I would not.
Not count on that.
I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. So, but no panicking this year.
That's
okay.
right.
I just want to thank you all so much for being part of this, and thank you for joining this edition of Governance Watch.